world came back to her in fragments. First, the sterile scent of antiseptic, then the beeping of machines, and finally, the blinding whiteness of hospital lights overhead. Her eyelids fluttered open and she blinked against the brightness, disoriented. Pain throbbed in her temples, dull and persistent like the remnants of a dream slipping away. But there was no dream, only emptiness. She didn't know her name, where she was, or how she had ended up in this place. A figure loomed over her, a man with concern etched into his rugged features. He was tall, with dark hair and sharp eyes that softened as they met hers. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low rumble, warm but cautious. "Do you remember me?" She tried to speak, but her throat was dry and the words stuck. She shook her head instead, a tiny motion that seemed to fracture something in his gaze. "I'm Tim," he continued, his tone gentle but firm, as if stating an undeniable truth. "Your husband." Her husband? The word felt foreign, like a puzzle piece from the wrong box. She wanted to believe him. The concern in his eyes seemed genuine, his presence steady and reassuring. But doubt gnawed at the back of her mind. There was something she couldn't place, something that made her chest tighten with unease. Before she could question him, the door to her room burst open and a figure dressed in black stormed in, a knife glinting in their hand. Instinctively, she recoiled, her body reacting faster than her mind could comprehend. But Tim was already moving, a blur of motion as he tackled the assassin to the ground, the sound of the struggle echoing in the small room. He overpowered the attacker with ease, his movements precise and efficient, as if he'd done this 1,000 times before. He bound the assassin's hands with a length of cord he pulled from his pocket, then turned to her, breathing heavily but otherwise unscathed. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with worry. She nodded, her heart racing. He had saved her, protected her. But why was there an assassin after her in the first place? And why did she still feel like she couldn't trust the man who claimed to be her husband? As they left the hospital in a flurry of whispered conversations and hurried movements, she tried to piece together the fragments of her memory. But all she found were more questions. They arrived at a secluded house, surrounded by dense trees and an eerie silence that set her on edge. Tim guided her inside, his hand resting lightly on her back, the touch almost too familiar. "Rest here," he said, leading her to a cozy bedroom. "You need to recover. I'll be nearby if you need anything." She nodded again, but as soon as he left, she started searching the room. There had to be something, anything, that could tell her who she really was. Her fingers brushed over a dresser and a mirror, and then she caught sight of herself, a stranger in the reflection, fierce and strong, yet vulnerable in her confusion. Before she could delve deeper, the door creaked open and she spun around to see a man standing there. He was younger than Tim, with a boyish face and sharp eyes that observed her carefully. "Hunter," he introduced himself, leaning against the doorframe with an easy smile. "I'm Tim's right-hand man. He asked me to keep an eye on you." Her instinct screamed at her to be wary, but she masked it with a charming smile of her own. "Thank you, Hunter. It's nice to know someone's looking out for me." He nodded, oblivious to the subtle way she was already assessing him, searching for a crack in his demeanor. If Tim was lying, then maybe Hunter could be her way out, a source of information she could exploit. As the days passed, she played her part, the perfect wife to the man who called himself her husband. But every affectionate gesture, every gentle word from Tim only deepened her confusion. He was protective, always close by, watching her with an intensity that made her heart flutter despite her suspicions. Was this love, or was it something more sinister? Her opportunity came one evening when Hunter mentioned a nearby town. "Tim wants me to pick up some supplies," he said offhandedly. "Let me come with you," she suggested, flashing him a playful smile. "I could use some fresh air." Hunter hesitated but eventually relented and they drove into town together. She used the trip to subtly probe him, learning bits and pieces of information about their lives. But every answer only added to her confusion. Tim, according to Hunter, had always been fiercely devoted to her. They had been inseparable, partners in every sense. Yet, Hunter's stories felt distant, like they belonged to someone else, not to the woman she had become. Just as they returned to the house, the tranquility shattered. A group of men emerged from the shadows, guns drawn, and her heart skipped a beat as she recognized them, or rather, the feeling they invoked in her. These men were her people. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. Their leader, a grizzled man named Tony, stepped forward, his gaze flickering between her and Hunter. "We're here to take you back," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Tim's been lying to you." She glanced at Hunter, who looked as surprised as she felt, then back at Tony. "I don't know who to believe," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Believe what you feel," Tony urged. "We're your family, not him." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps reached her ears. Tim appeared, his expression darkening as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" The tension in the air was palpable, a silent battle of wills between the two men. "She's coming with us," Tony declared, his grip tightening on his gun. Tim's eyes locked onto hers, pleading silently. "Jenny," he said, and she blinked at the name. It felt right, familiar. "You don't have to go with them. You're safe here with me." Her heart pounded as she looked between them, torn by the conflicting emotions swirling within her. She wanted answers, wanted to understand who she was and why these people were fighting over her. But before she could make a decision, another voice cut through the tension. A woman's voice, cold and mocking. "How touching," she drawled, stepping into the light. She was dressed in black, her eyes gleaming with malice. "But you won't live long enough to figure it out." The assassin from the hospital. Everything happened in a blur. The woman lunged at her, and Tim was there, shielding her with his body, taking the brunt of the attack. A knife plunged into his side, and he staggered back, blood staining his shirt. "Tim!" she screamed, rushing to his side as he collapsed to the ground. Hunter and Tony's men engaged the assassin, but she couldn't focus on anything other than the man lying in her arms, his blood warm against her skin. "I'm sorry," Tim gasped, his voice weak but urgent. "I should have told you the truth, but I couldn't lose you." "Tell me now," she pleaded, tears blurring her vision. I love you," he whispered, his hand weakly reaching up to touch her cheek. "I always have." His hand fell, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. But then the world came crashing back, and she realized that whatever the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. The man who had protected her, who had risked everything for her, was dying in her arms. Desperation clawed at her chest as she called for help, but deep down she knew it was too late. Tim's eyes fluttered shut, his breathing shallow, and she held him close, her heart breaking as the pieces of her past finally started to come together. She was Jenny, fierce, independent, and caught between two worlds. But at that moment, all she cared about was the man who had given everything to protect her, even if it had been built on lies. As the chaos around them faded, Jenny made a silent vow. She would uncover the truth, not just for herself, but for Tim. She would find out who she was, who he had been, and why they had been pulled into this deadly game. But for now, all she could do was hold on to the man she had thought was her enemy, only to realize too late that he had been something much more.